הבהרה, התוכן המשודר מבוסס על עדויות אישיות של מרואיינים אשר נאמרו על דעתם בלבד. אין לראות בתוכן משום המלצה כלשהי לרבות המלצה רפואית ו/או נפשית, ואין לראות בו משום עידוד לביצוע פעולות כלשהן.
Iands Israel. החיים שאחרי החיים.
שלום וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט המצולם של Iands ישראל. היום יש לנו אורחת מאוד חשובה, את ג'אניס הולדן, היא נשיאת Iands העולמי.
ג'אניס היקרה שלנו, קודם כל היא אישה מרתקת, היא חוקרת מומחית בחוויות, של חוויות מוות, היא חוקרת את זה כבר למעלה מ-30 שנים, עם העמיתים שלה, בין אם זה ברוס גרייסון, ריימונד מודי, היא בעצם חוקרת גם חוויות מוות, תקשורת טרנס-פרסונלית, תקשורת לאחר המוות. יש לה שורה של מחקרים שפורסמו בכתוביות. היא 31 שנה שימשה כדוקטור לחינוך יועצים בתחום הנפש בעצם, לאנשים שעברו חוויות רוחניות. זה נושא שצריך להעלות את המודעות אליו כאן אצלנו בארץ, שיהיה באמת את הגישה הזאת ושאת הטיפול לאנשים שעברו איזושהי חוויה רוחנית ומחפשים לעשות איזושהי אינטגרציה עם החיים שלהם שאחרי. בגדול, רוב המחקרים שלה עוסקים בחוויות שהן מחוץ לגבולות הזמן, המרחב והזהות האישית. אנחנו כאן כדי לדבר איתה. היא הנשיאה של איינדס, היא הייתה כבר נשיאה ב-2004, והיום היא שוב מכהנת כנשיאה באיינדס העולמי. כבוד ממש הוא לנו. שלום ג'אניס. Hello Janice.
Hello Janice, שלום.
Hi Ella and Henry, how are you today?
Very good.
Thank you for being here with us. We feel that the audience here in Israel needs to get a lot of information about NDE, what is NDE. So we will start, but before we will start, maybe you can tell us about the vision of the global Iands, how many branches there is in the world.
Okay. Well, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANDS, is a very big organization. Our mission is to advance global understanding of near-death and related experiences through research, education, and support. So for the research branch of our organization, we do things like we publish the Journal of Near-Death Studies, which is a scholarly peer-reviewed journal, and we offer a scholarship for a doctoral student doing a dissertation on near-death experiences every year. And for the education part, we hold conferences. For example, we have on April 30th, we have a one-day online symposium about providing care for people who've had near-death and related experiences. And it's for healthcare providers, family, friends, and others. And then in the fall, every fall, we have a conference as well, which this year again is going to be online because of the pandemic. And then for our support aspect, we have over 80 local groups around the world. Most of them are in the US, but some are in places like Israel, and where people meet usually once a month, and people who've had near-death experiences or related experiences, or who just have personal or professional interest in those kinds of experiences, can get together and share experiences and talk about the latest revelations from research and things like that. So we have a very big online presence through what's called Iands sharing groups online, where not only local groups meet, but people from around the world can meet. If they don't have a local group near them, they can meet online and have an online sharing group. And then we also have webinars and speakers and a book club and all of that online. So it's a big organization doing a lot of stuff.
Can you tell us what brought you to research near-death experiences?
Oh my, well, it wasn't any one thing. So we have to go way back. I'm 70 now, so we have to go back many, many years. I have always been interested in things that can't be easily explained, things of a spiritual nature that can't be easily explained. And like when I was growing up, I read books about famous mediums and that sort of thing. And then when I was a sophomore in college, I was home on vacation and my father was reading a book called The Great Soul Trial. And it's a nonfiction book about an actual trial that occurred in Arizona in the US back in around 1960. This man was a miner and he would go off into the mountains and mine for precious metals and things like that. And then he would come back to his little room and get money for what he had mined and put it in a safe deposit box. So he would go off for months at a time and then come back. Anyway, he went off one day, and after many, many months, he never came back. And after 5 years, I think, the state of Arizona presumed that he was dead. They opened his safe deposit box, and they found inside several $100,000 and a handwritten note that he wanted the money used for research on the survival of the human soul after death. So the state of Arizona did what they were required to do. They put a little notice in a paper saying that this, and they had to run it for a week or something. And they thought no one would pay attention to it and the state would just get to keep the money. Well, that didn't happen. Over 100 individuals and organizations came forward to try to claim the money. So the state of Arizona had to put on a trial where a judge heard each of these people or organizations explain how they would fulfill the wishes of this man's will. His name was James Kidd. And so among the entities that testified in this trial were the American Society for Psychical Research, the Psychical Research Foundation, and the Barrow Neurological Institute. And they all talked about how they would research the survival of the human soul after death. It was just, I now look back on that book as the most influential book of my life, because it really, I was only a sophomore in college at the time, doing my undergraduate work, studying psychology and studying behaviorism to boot. And, but it really got me thinking about how it is possible to do serious research on these subjects. And so then if you fast forward about, that was probably about 1970. And in around 1985, I was beginning to plan the dissertation for my doctoral degree. And long story short, I ended up doing the dissertation on something related to near-death experiences. And once I had done that research, I was just hooked. And I spent the next 30 plus years of my professional career researching near-death experiences and related experiences like after-death communication. So that's it.
Thank God.
Yeah.
I have a question for those who doesn't know the terms of near-death experience, because this term include, in Hebrew it's חוויית סף מוות. This term include a variety of experiences. Can you give us a few sentences of every kind?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you like an overview of what we know from research now. Okay, so a near-death experience is not the same thing as a close brush with death. So just because somebody survived a close brush with death through either illness or accidental injury or self-inflicted injury, it doesn't mean that they had a near-death experience. The near-death experience is a subjective experience during a close brush with death, in which the person experiences their consciousness functioning apart from their physical body, perceiving the material world, usually from a position above the body, but it can be away from the body as well, but perceiving the material world, and or perceiving transmaterial domains and entities. So including like deceased loved ones, spiritual figures, and environments that are like these beautiful natural environments where every blade of grass has consciousness and emanates light, and people see colors, they hear sounds like they've never heard on Earth. So it's beyond the material world. Now, what we know is that of all the people who survive a close brush with death, about 10 to 20% will report a near-death experience. The other 80 to 90% will just say that they don't remember anything. So, for example, in the most extreme case, if a person's heart stops, they're 8 or 9 out of 10 people who survive their heart stopping and get it, going again, will say that they don't remember anything from the time they passed out to the time they regain physical consciousness. But this 1 or 2 people out of every 10 will say that while their heart was stopped, they were out of their body, fully conscious and perceiving the material and or transmaterial domains. And so there's a lot more to say about what happens in each of those, but that's a good overview. And what we also know now is that these kinds of experiences occur not just in near-death circumstances, but other circumstances that tend to be like other extreme circumstances. Like sometimes people have them when they're in the extreme profound peace of meditation. Suddenly they'll have this experience of their consciousness being out of their body, observing the material world, going to transmaterial domains. So same kind of thing. Or sometimes people have this experience when they're in the extreme condition of exertion, like running a long marathon race. Suddenly they'll have this experience. And I even heard a man at an Iands conference say that he had the experience right in the middle of, he was absolutely overcome with jealousy and rage with his girlfriend, and they were having this argument, and he was just livid. And suddenly he was out of his body communicating with a spirit guide about this whole thing. And he said that the experience subjectively lasted about maybe what felt like 20 minutes. But when it was over, he was back in his body and he was finishing the word that he had started when the experience began. But now he was completely transformed. He calmed down. He just approached it very differently. And they, of course, ended up coming to a positive resolution, which would not have been what would have happened if he hadn't had the experience. So the point is that whenever we experience extreme circumstances like being close to death, being overcome with emotion, people have these experiences in the depths of grief. Sometimes they'll just be absolutely overcome with grief, maybe even feeling suicidal, and then have this experience or exertion or peace, any kind of extreme circumstance facilitates this experience to occur. when it happens, we also know that of all the people who've reported a near-death experience, at least 90% say that the experience was predominantly pleasurable, dominated by feelings like peace, joy, and love. About 10% say that the experience was distressing, dominated by distressing feelings like isolation or fear or horror of some kind. But even in those cases, most of the time, they're having the same features as a pleasurable near-death experience, but they're, for some reason, finding it unpleasant. So, for example, sometimes in the near-death experience, a person feels themselves moving rapidly through a space. It might be like a tunnel, or it could be just an open space or some other enclosure toward a light. Most people find this feeling ecstatic, but a few people find it distressing. So it's just good to know that the feelings they're usually very, very positive, sometimes distressing. And then the last thing is that near-death experiences result in some very specific after effects on people's lives. So that's another, people by and large are transformed by this experience, and which can be, it may be easy for them to adapt to the transformation, or it may be challenging for them to adapt to it. So that's one of the things that can happen afterwards.
Thank you. Can you tell us more about the after effects? Because most of the NDErs, they don't talk about the after effects and struggling with the integration. And, you know, I thought that maybe something is wrong with me. But when I talked with different NDErs around the world, I found out that there is struggling after that. And I think that we need to talk about it, because sometimes it makes people shy. Like, why I feel these emotions, those things. It's like the differences after having this experience. It's spiritual, emotional, physical, like it's so many.
Yes.
And I would like, if you can, like maybe talk more, so people who had this experience, they will understand themselves, you know?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, so first let's just talk about what the after effects are typically, and then we'll talk about the integration process. So I like to organize, it's very close to what you said. I like to organize the after effects. I don't know if in Israel you have this saying, but in the US, in English, when you write a letter and then you finish, but then you think of something else you want to say, you say P.S.
Yes, yes.
Well, so this is the P.S. after the NDE. Here are the P.S.s, and it is organized by P.S. So the first P is psychological. People's values shift dramatically. People become less materialistic, more concerned about others, and more understanding of other people's subjective experiences and other people's emotions. And they also almost always completely lose their fear of death, because they've experienced the first moments of death and they know that there's nothing to fear. So those are some of the psychological changes: the loss of fear of death, the changes in values. And then the first S is spiritual, and people become generally more interested in spirituality. Sometimes, usually, but not always, they actually get away from organized religion, because they find that what they experienced was not accounted for in their religion, that what they experienced is bigger than the religion that they knew. So they become more spiritual, but less religious. Now, that said, some people do continue and go deeper into their religion, but most identify as spiritual, but not religious. They have after effects that are sort of spiritual in nature, like precognition, knowing things that are going to happen in the future. They have telepathy, just being in a room with people. They know what everybody's feeling, and they know things about people. Meeting someone, they might know the person's history and that sort of thing, just, paranormally. And many people have an ongoing sense of connectedness to the spiritual domain that they experienced in their NDE. So they may continue to have communication with deceased loved ones that they met in their NDE, spiritual entities, and then sometimes more spiritual entities come into their lives, like spirit guides and that sort of thing. So their spiritual world is often very expanded after the NDE. Then the next P is physical, and that is that people often feel that their body physically has been transformed. They may need less sleep. They may be much more sensitive to foods and drugs. They might change their diet because, I know some NDEers who can't eat meat anymore. But then I know I have a friend who she had an NDE and she has to have meat every day. So it's not just one thing, but there is a noticeable shift in the way they function physically. People often become much more sensitive to chemicals, to things in the environment, and to like electricity, like being sensitive to electrical fields and knowing when lightning is going to strike before it strikes because they can feel a shift in the atmosphere. They also, another physical after effect is that they themselves have electromagnetic after effects, which is that the electrical things in their vicinity malfunction. So lights will blink, light bulbs will explode, computers and cell phones will crash, and I know one near-death experiencer, and this may be true of others, but I just know of one who can actually move things with her hand. That's a physical after effect. So there are a variety of physical things. And then the last S is social. So imagine that somebody is going along in their life, they have some kind of medical crisis, have a near-death experience, and when they regain consciousness, they are transformed. Well, they're not the same person they were before the near-death experience. So this is going to reverberate in their social world. They're changed psychologically, spiritually, and physically. It's going to have an effect on their social relationships. So we know that people change, like groups of friends, they change organizations that they're affiliated with. They change their careers, tending to move into careers that have to do with service to humanity. And and we know that if someone is married when they have a near-death experience, they're at much greater likelihood of getting divorced, because once again, the person who had the near-death experience is not the person that originally got into the marriage. And so it just disrupts the marriage. But I'll also say that one of the things I've noticed is that when near-death experiencers get divorced, there's usually relatively little acrimony. And sometimes the near-death experiencer actually helps their ex-spouse find a new spouse. So it's it's because they're more loving and caring. So psychological, spiritual, physical, and social after effects. So now that leads into the question of integration, which is that you can imagine if one of the things we know from research, near-death experiences vary in their depth. That is, some have only like one feature, some have many features. Sometimes a feature is relatively matter of fact, sometimes it's very emotionally intense. So the more features and the more intense those features, the more after effects the person is going to have. Mm-hmm. And so people who have relatively deeper NDEs are likely to be more challenged after the NDE because they have transformed and they have to adapt to this new person that they've become. Probably one of the biggest effects psychologically is people's basic beliefs about the cosmos are shattered. They may have grown up with certain religious beliefs and so forth about the nature of consciousness and probably don't even think about that. And then in the NDE, suddenly their consciousness is functioning apart from their physical body very lucidly and able to do things that we can't do in the physical body, like both see walls and see through walls, hear people's thoughts, move at the speed of thought. That if I think about, I wonder what so-and-so is doing, boom, I'm there and I'm watching what they're doing. It's just mind-blowing. And so then the person comes back to their physical body, their physical life, and they just have a completely different view of reality. It's a lot to digest. And then usually in addition, because in many cases the person has been through a medical crisis, there's the complication of recovering from the medical crisis, making sense of what they experienced. NDEs are ineffable. They're very difficult to explain because they involve perceptions, in domains that are different than the domain that language was created to manage. We developed language to manage this material domain. Those experiences transcend the material, so they're very difficult to explain in material terms. So there's that challenge on top of everything else. So it can be very, very disruptive. And our research indicates that for a person to feel fully integrated, really at peace with their newfound sense of self, newfound sense of the cosmos, can take an average of about 7 years. So it's for most people a rather long process. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm still a baby, maybe.
Yeah, Ella, when was your NDE? What year was it?
6.5 years ago.
6.5?
And you remind me so many things that I'm going through. From my experience, I know today that this is not paranormal. Mm-hmm. Because this is our true nature. We're supposed to feel each other.
I think that's right. Yes, that for some reason that's a mystery to me. When we are born into this world and we become socialized, we lose our connectedness to each other. I think that essentially we are connected and we lose that. And when people have near-death experiences and other kinds of experiences, other mystical experiences, can reestablish the awareness of our essential connectedness. And it's kind of a mystery to me why life is the way it is, that we lose that and have to have something like a near-death experience to regain our felt sense of connectedness to each other.
You don't need to have NDE if you will be open-minded and connected to your inner voice. you will see that God is connect with us in every level, through stuff, through people, through trees, through everything. So we just need to be aware.
Is there a difference between children's NDE and grown-ups?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer it, let me say something bigger first, and then I'll come back to that. Near-death experiences are equal opportunity experiences. They occur to people of all ages, both sexes, any demographic that you can think of, like education level or belief system or anything like that. Research shows that the experience occurs equally to all people. So it's kind of like you can believe whatever you want, but when you die, this is what's going to happen. And so that said, about children's near-death experiences, imagine that being an adult and having this happen and have your whole world kind of turned upside down. Imagine if you're just a child and you have this experience, and how hard it is to explain, how profound it is, having the effects of like knowing what my friends are thinking, and things that are just not typical. It can be really, really challenging for children.
The life review is not the same, right?
Yes, well, the NDE itself, actually, it seems like the features are the same, but children sometimes describe them in different terms. Now, we haven't talked exactly about the features of near-death experiences, but one of them is, as you said, Henry, the life review. Usually this occurs in the presence of a being of light that is all-knowing and all-loving. And while the person is in the presence of this light, they experience a review of their earthly life. And usually it's every moment of their life, kind of chronologically, although they say that it also is happening all at once. It's one of those things that's hard to explain. And the person not only re-experiences what they experienced in the original situations, but they also experience being every person with whom they interacted. So like someday when we three all pass, we have our life reviews, we will each re-experience this moment, and I'll remember not only what it was to be me talking about this, but I'll know what it was to be Ella, what it was to be Henry, hearing me talk about this. And so, so for adults, the life review, of course, tends to be rather long. Sometimes children, well, not every person in their near-death experience has a life review. And that's true both for every age group. But I have read accounts of children as young as 3 having a life review. One little boy who was 5 had been very mean to his little brother. So in his life review, he experienced what it was to be on the receiving end of his actions. And after his near-death experience, he was a much nicer brother. So he was only 5. And so, of course, it's going to be shorter for a child. And it might be that children are less likely to have a life review just because they haven't had as much life and as much opportunity to make voluntary choices, you know, that would come across in the life review. Also, children will describe their NDE in the terms they have. And so like one child, instead of saying that he moved rapidly through a tunnel, he said, I went really fast through a big noodle. And that brings up another topic that I don't know if you were planning to ask about, but the role of culture in near-death experiences. And what we have come to understand through research is that NDEs need to be understood at 3 levels. there's at a very deep level, there are these commonalities, like the experiencing one's consciousness functioning outside the body, meeting spiritual entities, going to spiritual domains, having a life review. No NDE has all of those things, but when you look at a lot of them, you'll see this pattern of repeated modalities of those kinds of things. So this seems to be universal across cultures. Jeffrey Long has a website called nderf.org that includes a lot of cross-cultural near-death experiences, meaning not from the U.S. And he's analyzed them and found that every feature that we've seen in U.S. NDEs, we've seen in international NDEs, and including from like completely non-Western, non-English cultures. So there's this universal level at a very deep level. Then, however, there is a level where culture both influences the way the person perceives the experience and the way they talk about it when it's over. So if you see a light that's all-knowing and all-loving, what word do you use for that? You know, it's like not anything that anybody ever talked about. So some people will say, that was God. Or they'll say, I don't have a word for it, but the closest I can say is God. And then some people will say, I don't want to use the word God because this was so much bigger than any concept of God that anybody has on the planet. So, cultural, the whole thing about just knowing what to call things that one experiences is going to be influenced by culture. And it's possible that culture influences the forms that things take. That, if I were, as a Western US person, if I were to see Shiva, that might not even be something that I can comprehend. So things are likely to take forms that I'm able to comprehend. So culture has an influence on the content and the way that we talk about the content afterwards. But again, it doesn't change that there are these universal features that come up. They might be described differently in different cultural contexts, but when you start looking at them, you realize, oh, they're all talking about this same universal thing. Then there's the universal level, the cultural level, and then finally there's a personal level, which is that every near-death experience is unique, and it's unique to that individual. So, I'm not likely going to meet Elah's deceased loved ones. I'm going to meet, or if I do, I won't recognize them, but I'll meet my own deceased father and mother and aunts and cousins and so forth, and friends, my dear friends, and even people meet deceased pets in their NDEs. So there's that personal level as well. So it's best to understand that there is this universal foundation that has its cultural and personal expressions.
According to your researchers, there is different elements of NDE. I wonder if, like you said, that you didn't find NDE who had all the elements. Mm-hmm. Well, does the number of elements influence about the depth of the experience? Is there a way to measure the experience? Maybe like what your colleague, Professor Bruce Grayson, maybe his skill or something else. Is there a way?
Yes. As you said, Bruce Grayson many years ago developed the NDE scale, the near-death experience scale. And it has 16 items. And it is assessing the experience itself, not the after effects, but the experience itself. And for each element, a person can say that the element was not present, that it was present in not very intense form there, but not very intense. And then the third possibility is it was there and it was very intense. And so if you figure that 16 times 3 is 48, so somebody can range from 0, that they don't remember anything, to 48, they remember all 16 of these elements, like being out of their body, meeting deceased loved ones, having a life review, meeting a being of light, those kinds of things. If they experienced all of them intensely, they'd get a 48, and no one's ever scored a 48. But what we know from research is that if someone scores 7 or higher, then very likely what they had was a bona fide near-death experience. If they scored lower, they might have still had a near-death experience, but it's, at least for the purposes of research, we wouldn't include somebody like that in a study. But they could very well have had an NDE. It just wasn't strong enough to be considered an NDE in a very official way.
Can someone who experienced NDE come back and, predict the future? Did you had some experience with that, with NDEs that came back with like messages or predictions?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Some near-death experiencers, I'll say Robert Mays and his wife Suzanne Mays have studied this pretty extensively. And they've looked at near-death experiences that included visions of the future, like visions for humanity. And the bad news is that most of them see humanity going through a really difficult time over the next many years. And now, many of these people had their NDEs back in, like 1970 or something, before we knew things about, the global, the climate crisis and things like that. But now we know that we're headed for some difficult times just in terms of climate and the effects that's going to have. So it seems like their visions for the future are taking shape. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. People also in their NDEs see their personal future. They may see scenes from the future, and they also may see their own past lives. And because of that, many people come back from near-death experiences being more of a believer in reincarnation. Mm-hmm. And of course, most people in the Western world have not been taught that that's the way things work. But NDEers lean toward believing that is the way things work.
Professor Bruce Grayson, he told us that you had a research, you took NDEers who had, in their experience, they connected to the knowledge of the universe. I thought it was genius, the research, because what you were trying to do is to hypnotize those people to get them back to being connected to the universal knowledge and find out the cure for cancer.
It wasn't cancer, but it was a rare disease that this person approached me who had some money, and this person had this disease and had been funding traditional medical research. And they wanted to, try to help find a cure for it. And the traditional research had not been progressing over something like 10 years. So he had the idea of using near-death experiencers who had had that experience of universal knowledge and doing hypnotic regression and see if they could come up with information. Yeah, it was a very interesting study.
And I love that you said that, I read it somewhere, that you said maybe God give us to get until here. Like there is no permission.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Research on veridical perception. So veridical perception is the situation where, based on the condition and position of the physical body, the person shouldn't been able to know things that happened, yet because they experienced their consciousness out of their body, they could perceive things and were later verified as accurate. And so I don't know if Bruce told you, did he tell you the case of the person flapping their arms? Did he tell you that one? Okay, so this is a really good example, and it was a case that Bruce himself investigated, so we know that it's very solid. So this man was in surgery, and he flatlined, his heart stopped. And they were able to resuscitate him and finish the surgery. And when it was over, he told his nurse, when he first regained consciousness, he told his nurse that he knew that his heart had stopped. He'd been out of his body, and he saw his surgeon flapping his arms as if trying to fly. And the nurse thought that sounded really weird, and she knew that Bruce was researching near-death experiences, so she contacted him, and she told him about it. So Bruce came, and he interviewed the guy, and he said, yes, that he saw the surgeon doing this. And so Bruce started with everybody who had been in the operating room and went to them one at a time. And the last person he went to was the surgeon, and everybody told the same story, that in fact, the surgeon does like this kind of thing. But Bruce is like, he'd never heard of anybody doing this before. The surgeon had been trained in Japan. And he told Bruce that when he scrubs in before surgery, and his hands are sterile, in order to keep himself from touching anything, he puts them on his sterile gown. And then he backs into the operating room, and he stands there while his assistants are doing the initial things, like opening the person up and, all that. And he'll say, use this and move that over and don't, be careful right there, doing this. So he's using his elbows to point as he's talking. It's not something that makes noise. So the patient couldn't have heard it, despite the fact that, in addition to the fact that he was actually dead when this was happening. And it's something everybody just knew the surgeon did. Nobody talked about it. It was just an idiosyncrasy of this one surgeon. So the question is, how could somebody who was completely anesthetized and dead know what the surgeon was doing, and he, of course, claimed that he could see it. So there are many cases like this. And if somebody wants to read about them, they're compiled in a book called The Self Does Not Die. So 6 different teams of investigators have tried to capture veridical perception in a more controlled way. We've gone into hospital, planted a visual, some kind of visual thing up above visual height, but facing the ceiling, down below the ceiling, but facing the ceiling, because most of the time when people report that they're out of their body, they report that their consciousness, if they're in a room, their consciousness goes to a ceiling corner. We don't know why, that's what they say. So what we hope is they're up in the ceiling corner, and then right below them is this visual stimulus that they'll notice and remember. Well, long story short, 6 different studies, some of them very extensive, with many hospitals and hundreds of cardiac arrests, resuscitated cardiac arrests, and we've never captured one case. And I sometimes wonder if there's something going on at a higher level. There's a higher wisdom that humanity isn't ready yet for this to be really confirmed, because we're not spiritually mature enough to take that information and and use it in ways that really are good for humanity. So yeah, we haven't captured it yet in a controlled way.
Is it right to say, like, with the experiences that were verified with this reality, like my experience and a lot of other people's experiences, is it right to say that those experiences are objective experiences?
Yes. So one of the things that we know about near-death experiences is, for the most part, people who have them are adamant that the experience was real. And they'll say that either the experience was as real as this reality, or it was more real than this reality, like realer than real. But that's all subjective. And so these cases of veridical perception provide objective evidence that people's consciousness really is out of their body, perceiving accurately the material world. And so, yeah, so it provides some objective verification of NDEs. Mm-hmm.
In your book with Ryan Foster, Connecting Soul, Spirit, Mind and Body, you do a separation between mind, body, spirit, soul. What is the relationships between them, you know? Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Well, of course, we know what the body is.
Yes.
And this is just my concept, that spirit is everything. It's the level at which it's the most fundamental level. It's the most immanent, meaning infused in reality level. It's everything. It's the means through which we are connected and all of that. So spirit is everything. Soul is one expression of spirit, one personal expression of spirit. So it's kind of like spirit is the ocean and soul is a wave that emerges from the ocean. Okay. And mind is the brain limited expression of soul, meaning that I perceive the brain as a filter of soul. And so there's a lot going. When we leave our bodies, we experience our soul much more fully. When we're in our bodies, our brains filter what can come into our consciousness. So mind is related to the brain-based body, what happens subjectively in the brain-based body. Soul is the larger reality that we know only in a limited way when we're physically embodied. And then spirit is the big everything where everybody's connected to everybody.
So why do we use the word consciousness? Is consciousness and soul, it's the same? Is there any difference between them?
Yeah, it's a great question. To my thinking, they're the same. I use them interchangeably. However, the word soul tends to be more associated with religion. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm speaking in non-religious circumstances, I tend to use the word consciousness because it's not as religiously laden a term.
You also guide psychiatrists and therapists to help people who had spiritual experiences. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the importance of medical staff to know, to be aware about NDE, not only psychiatrists and psychology, also doctors and the hospital?
It's huge. And the reason is that I've actually done a study asking near-death experiencers to describe their experiences, disclosing their near-death experience to a healthcare provider, like a physician, a nurse, a counselor, psychologist, social worker, anybody who's a health, even religious and spiritual health providers like chaplains and clergy, and ask them to think of their most memorable experience disclosing their NDE to a healthcare provider, memorable for whatever reason whatever they deem memorable. And then thinking about that experience, whether they came away from it feeling helped, not influenced, or harmed. And what we know from that research is that 1/5 of people say that they felt harmed by the experience of disclosing their NDE to a healthcare provider. And what constituted harm was that first of all, the healthcare provider didn't acknowledge the experience as a near-death experience. They were like clueless about what, like, I've never heard of that before, or they dismissed it as, oh, well, you were hallucinating, it was just drugs, something, or it was part of your illness, and they dismiss it or disqualify it in some way. Or they diagnose the person as having a mental disorder based on the NDE alone. And research shows that, well, let me go back to the first one. First of all, near-death experiences are a thing. And people need to be acknowledged when they tell it. They may not realize what they had was a near-death experience, and the healthcare provider can help them by saying, it sounds like you might have had what's called a near-death experience. Have you heard of those? If they haven't, then you say, well, it's this thing that people have sometimes during close brushes with death and other circumstances. If they have heard about them, to help the person realize that was a near-death experience, and come to the realization. Diagnosing people, research clearly shows that there's no relationship between near-death experiences and mental disorder. Now, that said, people with mental disorders have near-death experiences, but they have them at the same rate as people without mental disorders. So there's no connection between NDEs and mental. There is never justification for diagnosing someone with a mental disorder based only on an NDE. The third thing that can happen that's harmful is that the person or the experience is demonized. Especially clergy, chaplains might say things like, well, if you didn't see Jesus in your near-death experience, then it was of the devil. And, don't talk about it anymore. And that can, completely freak the person out. And I know a case of more than one case, but one in particular is coming to mind, of a boy who was 7 during his when he had his NDE, talked to his minister about it. The minister said that. And then for 20 years, he didn't talk about the experience and really felt this unresolved feeling all that time until he discovered that NDEs are a thing and came out. So it's and that illustrates how when people are harmed, when they're not helped to identify the NDE, made to know that it's a normal, although a minority experience, but still a normal minority experience for people who've survived a close brush with death. It doesn't have anything to do with mental disorder. It is very likely to yield spiritually beneficial effects. So it's numinous rather than demonic. Then people can be helped to usually people after an NDE, they want to learn more about it. They want to talk with other people who've had the experience, and setting this up in this way enables them then to go forward and use the resources that are available to help them process and integrate the experience.
There is some percentage of people who had unpleasant experiences, like the void, the darkness.
Yes.
Do you think there is a correlation between the person's consciousness before he's getting the NDE
I actually sort of know the answer to that. All the studies that we've done trying to identify characteristics that differentiate the 90% of people who have pleasurable NDEs from the 10% who have distressing NDEs have found no differences. There's no demographic difference, no difference in terms of their life history, their belief system, anything like that. And everyone who studied distressing NDEs has concluded that really anybody can have one. Now, that said, I do think that there may be something from the Buddhist idea that our mental state when we're dying can influence the subjective experience we have, at least at the beginning of our death experience. And so when people are feeling very frightened, like I know somebody who had a distressing NDE going into her second childbirth, and her first childbirth had been horrendous, and now she's going into her second one. She's full of fear, and then she dies on the delivery table and has a distressing near-death experience. I suspect that her fear of the whole childbirth process may have contributed to that. But that said, we know people who've been terrified of going into something have a completely pleasurable NDE. And we know people who have, for no reason, no identifiable reason whatsoever, have a distressing NDE. But a really important thing about distressing and pleasurable NDEs is that research also shows in the short term, people who had a distressing NDE are likely to be afraid of death, understandably, right? But in the long term, they show the same after effects as people who had pleasurable NDEs. So once they integrate the experience and make sense of it, they end up having these, psychological, spiritual, physical, and social after effects that we saw with pleasurable NDEers, including a loss of fear of death.
After many years of research, is it right to say that this reality is one super organism, that we're in him? What's the meaning of the reality?
Well, now we're getting more into the domain of my interpretation. So this isn't research data; it's my conclusions about things. And yes, my conclusion is that there is a universal consciousness of which we are all part. And for some mysterious reason, when we're physically alive, many of us are ignorant of that reality. And we come to discover it only through experiences like near-death experience and other mystical kinds of experiences. But the implications of that for living life in the material world, I think, are huge. If I know that that I one day am going to experience you in my interactions with you, I'm going to be you, then everything I do, I think about that. And I often ask myself, as I'm about to do something or say something or write a nasty email to somebody, I ask myself, how will this play in my life review? And I often change how I'm going to relate to the person. And it has implications for even institutions and governments about how we treat each other and how we share the resources that are on Earth. And I'm sure that doesn't take away the challenge of finding ways to share them equitably, but that would be the direction, you know, that I live a nice life. I'd like everybody to live the life that I have. How can I help that to come about? That's a very different mentality than the starting point of most governments. And so, so I think that NDEs have implications at all levels, from the personal to the institutional. Yeah.
Can you share with us experience that you exposed to, or the research that you had that was life-changing for you?
What was the most jaw-dropping NDE you ever heard?
Well, I would say it isn't just one, but the ones that I'm most fascinated by are those involving veridical perception. You know, there's a story, for example, of a woman who was in surgery, unexpectedly flatlined, was resuscitated. They finished the surgery, bring her to post-op. She comes out of the anesthesia, and her physician comes to visit her and see how she's doing. And she says, I know that I died on the operating table. And he's like, how do you know that? And she said, well, I was out of my body and I watched, you did this and this person did that and this person did that and said this. And he was like amazed at that, which he shouldn't have been if he knew anything. But anyway, he was amazed by that. But then she said, you know, I was located above the ceiling and I was looking down through the ceiling, and I could also see into the adjacent operating room. And there they were amputating a man's leg. And when they finished the amputation, they put the leg in a yellow plastic bag to dispose of it. The physician's listening to her, and I saw him interviewed online. The interview isn't available anymore, but I saw him interviewed, and he said, you know, I don't know what's going on in the other rooms of the hospital. How can my patient, who was literally dead at the time that this is happening, how could she know this? So at this point, which is now a few hours after the surgery, he goes to the hospital records and he looks, and indeed in the adjacent operating room, they were amputating a man's leg. Now, because that was a specialized operating room for amputations and things that he didn't do, he'd never been in there before. But at this time, 3 hours later, the room happened to be empty. So he went in and he peeked inside, and there he saw the yellow plastic bags that they used to dispose of amputated body parts. So how can somebody, a patient who that even her surgeon didn't know things that she knew and were verified as accurate? So those are the ones that I find the most interesting, because they, as Ela said before, they provide objective evidence that then lends credibility to the implications of NDEs. You know, if you think they're hallucinations, and that, you know, this thing about feeling what other people feel, you know, that's a bunch of muck. If you believe that the experiences are real, then all those implications take on a lot more, carry a lot more weight.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you have conclusions about reincarnation from your researchers?
Yeah, I have a personal conclusion, but it's so let me back up and say, as we mentioned, that NDEers sometimes see their past lives and come back with a new idea for them, new to them, that they lived before. This has actually been studied in depth by at the University of Virginia by Ian Stevenson and then his successor, Jim Tucker. And they've written several books, and they have many cases of where they try to explain how a child could remember a previous lifetime with all these specific, accurate details. And they try to try to explain how the child could have done this through just normal material means. And there are many cases where they just can't explain it any other way than through reincarnation. And there are cases, speaking of the reincarnation cases that I find most influential, Stevenson wrote a book called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect. And these are cases where a child is born with a birth defect or a birthmark that corresponds to a traumatic death in their previous lifetime. So there's like some physical carryover, like that the soul somehow remembers and then imprints that traumatic memory on their new body. And many cases of that. So there's a lot of stuff going on around past lives that most people in the Western world just aren't aware of, but there's extensive, very meticulous research about it. So personally, I have concluded that I believe in reincarnation. And that's not only from all the reading that I've done, which I've done a lot of it, but I've actually trained in past life therapy and had experiences myself that even confirm that further.
What have the studies about people who attempted suicide and had NDE revealed?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because it might seem like if somebody has this near-death experience that is profoundly pleasurable, they experience peace, joy, and love beyond anything even close to what they've experienced in the physical world, you'd think they'd want to do everything they could to get back there as soon as possible. But what actually research shows, and this is primarily a study by Bruce Grayson, but also others, that when someone has attempted, first of all, what we know in the mental health field, there's a certain likelihood of people who will attempt suicide. If one of them does attempt suicide, the likelihood goes up that they're going to attempt again. But if in their attempt they had a near-death experience, the likelihood drops down below the regular level of suicide likelihood in society. And the reason is that in their near-death experience, they discovered that their lives have meaning, that we are here for a reason. And to kill ourselves, like it's an option. It's just that if you do it, it's a lot like dropping out of school. You're going to have, when you come back, you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to start where you left off. So you might as well stick with the life that you've begun. And that they also learn that our trying experiences, our challenging, difficult experiences are opportunities to advance spiritually. Like I can relate that sometimes when I've been at my lowest times in life, I've been the most empathic to other people. I've been the most understanding and caring to others when I've been in my own worst pain. And so those are the kinds of lessons that we can draw from our suffering. And that we're meant to be here and have the experiences we do to advance in our own spiritual development, to move toward those spiritual fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And that's what life gives us the opportunity to do. So they no longer look upon their trials and tribulations as being horrible and that the only escape is to die. They see them as opportunities to develop and move through and come through more spiritually advanced than they were before.
I wonder about the relationship between the soul or consciousness and the light and God. Is there any bioresearchers
hierarchy?
Yeah.
A hierarchy. I would say from near-death experiences, no. I have the impression what people experience in the first moments of death gives only a glimpse of what they experience once their physical body can no longer be brought back to life, and they move deeper into the experience of death. Now, I have read books, just not scientific research books, but books like by people who claim to have communication with the deceased, where they describe like 7 levels of existence in death, and that one's spiritual development each level is associated with a greater level of spiritual development. That's not at all from anything that I would call scientific research. It's more speculative, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we're not in scientific research, can I ask you something? Yeah. Can you tell us something about the creator?
Well, here's some things that I've come to believe myself. And it is based on the way people describe the being of light in near-death experience, that this is the source of everything in the universe, except that phenomena can be relatively connected or disconnected from that source. I often think in terms of the analogy of heat and cold. I don't know if you know this, but there is no such thing as cold energy. There's only heat and the absence of heat. The more heat is absent, the more cold it gets. And that's not to say that coldness isn't really powerful, like, people get frostbite and all that from lack of heat. So it's important, but if you're trying to remedy cold, the way to do it is to bring in heat. And I think the same is true regarding love and evil, that evil is not an independent force that is in opposition to love. It is the absence of love. So the way to counter evil is to bring in love. Now, I don't claim to know how to do that in a lot of cases, but and there are other complications, related to how this all manifests in the material world. But the point is that this essence of the universe, the energetic essence of the universe, I believe, is love. When we're encountering things that seem evil or that sort of thing, they're lacking love. They're not like a separate force.
Yeah, in the Kabbalah, the lack of light is not darkness, because darkness is its own creation. You need the darkness as well as the light. So you need these two forces. So, yeah, I just wondered,
That's interesting. Yeah. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Would you like to share with us a spiritual experience that you had?
Let's see. My sigh is about which one to choose.
Okay.
One experience, I've had several experiences of after-death communication. I've had experiences of precognition, mediumship, unintended. I didn't intend to, but I served as a medium of communication between a living and a deceased person. I've had past life memories. So I've had a lot of experiences, but I'll just talk about an after-death communication. My father, I was close to my father, and he, in his later years, developed Alzheimer's disease. where he got to the point that he didn't even really recognize who I was. And, but the last few years of his life, he lived in assisted living, an institution, and he felt very, in the beginning of that time, he had enough awareness that he was lonely, and it was really emotionally painful for him. And I wish that I could do something to ease his emotional pain, but I couldn't. I was limited in the things that I could do. And I just really felt bad that the last few years of his life, he was suffering. And so anyway, finally he died. And for the first few months after he died, whenever I would think about him, I would get to this place of regret that his last few years had been the way that they had. And I was just kind of stuck there. So one night while I was asleep, I had this experience. It wasn't a dream, although I was still asleep, but I became very conscious, and lucid. And my father was sitting across from me, kind of like the way Ella is right now, at a table, seeing him from the waist up. And so a little bit more about him. The last few months of his life, he couldn't feed himself because he had hand tremors and the food would just go everywhere. So he had to be fed. And so in this image that I had of him, a plate of food is in front of him and he has a fork, and he lifts the fork and he holds it right here. And then he pauses and he looks at me. And in that look was absolute, unconditional, eternal love. It was just a look of love. And he himself looked a little younger than he had when he died, definitely healthier. Obviously, he was back, mentally, and able to nourish himself. And that all we did was just look at each other, and there were no specific thoughts or words or anything, just that. And it lasted maybe 45 seconds or so and then faded. And I never woke up at that point until the morning, when I woke up and I remembered this experience, that's not the way dreams operate. We forget our dreams, but this was just seared in my memory. And I realized that the last 3 years of his life were just a tiny blip on a long radar of an eternal loving relationship with him. And that was the important thing, not that little, moment of suffering. And so consequently, whenever I would think about him afterwards, if I did get to that place of regret, I would remember the experience of encountering him after his death, and remember that, that wasn't, that little short time of suffering wasn't important. What's important is our eternal and unconditional love for each other that continues on. So, and I also know that he's a few different times he's just popped in to say hello. One time I was at a weekend with a friend of mine named Mary Jo. And the last presenter of the weekend was Brian Weiss, who is a famous past life regression psychiatrist. And he instructed us to do an exercise called psychometry. And in that exercise, two people who don't know each other exchange something precious to them, like your wedding ring or a favorite necklace or something like that. And then you just sit opposite each other, close your eyes, holding the other person's thing, and then just note what comes to you. So when it was, anyway, after he gave us the instructions, you know, that we were supposed to find a partner and this is what we'd be doing, and we're supposed to find somebody we didn't know, my friend Mary Jo turned to me and said, do you want to do this together? And so I knew her and I thought, oh, you know, but I didn't want to say no to her. So I said, okay. Well, when it was over and he said, you know, open your eyes, she said, oh, I have to tell you what I got. She said, I don't know if this means anything to you, but she said, I saw a road trip from Chicago to Maine. These are two places in the US, and ending at a lighthouse and a woman standing in front of the lighthouse. She could not have known this because she's from Chicago and I never talked about this with her. But when I still lived in Chicago, so this was like 15 years before, my husband and I took a road trip to Maine to this place called Pemaquid Point that has this lighthouse. And my husband took a picture of me in front of the lighthouse. And when we got home, we showed my parents our pictures. And my father is an artist, and he saw this one, and he asked if he could keep it or borrow it. And I'm like, sure. So I gave it to him. Subsequently, we moved to Texas. Long story short, we ended up buying a house. And the first time my parents came to visit, my father brought a housewarming gift that was a painting of, I'm going to show it to you. So he had painted this, and this, in the original picture, I was standing here in grubby camping clothes. So he took me out, he found this model from a catalog, a clothing catalog, and put her in. But there's the lighthouse, and I just love this painting because to me, it's like earth and water. And there's, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a light beaming down on the lighthouse. So there's like this spiritual, and the lighthouse, you know, emerging up into the spiritual domain. I just love this painting, and he made it for me. And she Beautiful. Had no idea whatsoever about the trip, the painting, or anything else. It was like my father taking the opportunity to stop in and say hi.
Thank you so much for your being, and you're stunning. Thank you for everything.
You're very welcome, and thank you for what you're doing in Israel.
I'm blessing you to continue to spread the light of love, for us to be, that we will all be like who we really are. One unit of love. Thank you so much, and I hope we will talk soon and meet in Israel.
Oh, I'd love that. I'd love that. Okay,
thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.